Muhammad Noor is going to be back in court tomorrow for the judge to hand down a sentence.
The guidelines say that it is likely to be around 12.5 years, 2/3 of which he will be behind bars. So how do courts determine these felony sentences? Good question. Here's Heather Brown.
40 years ago, a convicted criminal would get a range, 0 to 5, 10 to 15, and it was up to the warden or parole board to decide how long they'd stay.
And we found that there was a real inequitability in how that was being enforced.
So in 1980, Minnesota created one of the first sentencing commissions in the country. Judge Carline Lennon is a member. They've taken what the law says.
Well, sentences are set by the legislature.
And over the years have come up with guidelines. The ranges are all laid out on a grid.
Starting out with how serious is this offense?
There are 11 categories, ranging from murder to fleeing a police officer on one axis.
But then we look at the offender, too.
And a criminal history score on the other. That's based on prior convictions, juvenile records, and custody status.
So really, it's just a formula. We're just adding up numbers, and we're putting it on a grid, and we're saying that's where your sentence should be. Typically.
That typically is important because a judge can decide to go outside those guidelines.
How often do you depart from the guidelines?
It's infrequent.
It's almost impossible to do after the prosecutors and defense agree to a plea deal. But in that small number of trials,
the judge can look at that range and say, that's too much. That sentence is an overreaction. But if they're going outside of what the guidelines would call for, they have to justify that.
In 2017, it happened about a quarter of the time, and overwhelmingly the judge sentenced the offender to less. Giving more time is difficult and requires a jury to be involved. A judge can decide probation over prison time.
Because they're chemically dependent, limited capacity.
Or less time behind bars.
The classic example is the drug dealer and his girlfriend.
Has the judge already made their decision going in that morning, or did they listen to all the victim impact statements and then say at the end, okay, now this is what I decide?
Well, you'd probably get about 250 some answers from judges across the state.
Heather Brown, WCCO 4 News.
Sex crimes have their own grid, as do drug-related crimes.
First-degree murder is not on the general grid because it is an automatic life in prison sentence in Minnesota. If you have a good question for Heather, just email it by going to WCCO.com/links.